A simple pizza delivery spirals into a chilling mystery when Ethan, a young courier, notices something unsettling about Mrs. Harper, one of his regular customers. Her absence tonight feels wrong, like a ripple in the familiar rhythm of his evenings. Known for her warm smile and nightly pepperoni pizza order, Mrs. Harper was a constant in Ethan's unpredictable job, someone who brought a touch of comfort to his long shifts. But tonight, her silence is deafening. Ethan tries to shake the growing unease, telling himself she probably just skipped dinner. Yet, the thought lingers, gnawing at him. Acting on instinct, he decides to stop by her house, picking up her favorite order along the way. As he drives into the neighborhood, an eerie quiet blankets the street. Mrs. Harper's house is shrouded in darkness, her porch light, the light she once said kept her company, completely off. A chill creeps over Ethan as he steps out of his car. With each step toward her door, the shadows seem heavier, the air colder, his unease louder. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's get started. Ethan's knuckles rapped lightly on the door. "Mrs. Harper, it's Ethan," he called, his voice steady despite the unease churning inside him. Silence. He knocked again, a little louder this time. The creak of the door startled him as it opened just a sliver, revealing the frail figure of Mrs. Harper. She looked nothing like the lively woman he remembered. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her silver hair, usually so neatly kept, hung limply around her face. Her trembling hands gripped the doorframe, and a bandage wrapped awkwardly around one wrist. Ethan's heart sank. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I brought your usual," he said, forcing a smile and lifting the pizza box. "I just wanted to check on you." Her eyes darted nervously behind her, and she hesitated before speaking again. "That's very kind, but I'm not hungry tonight." Her words were clipped, her tone rushed, as though she wanted him to leave. Ethan glanced past her into the dimly lit house. Papers were strewn across a nearby table, and a chair lay tipped on its side. This wasn't like her. "Are you sure you're okay, Mrs. Harper? You don't look well." Her lips quivered, and for a moment he thought she might open up. But then, her face hardened. "Thank you, Ethan, but I'm fine. You should go home now," she said firmly, shutting the door before he could respond. Standing on the porch, Ethan felt torn. Her guarded posture and the mess inside painted a picture that screamed trouble. Returning to his car, he sat in silence, his thoughts racing. Something is wrong. I know it. The untouched pizza box sat beside him as he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, debating his next move. Ethan's fingers tapped restlessly on the steering wheel. He couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Harper's pale face, the trembling in her voice, or the chaos he glimpsed inside her home. Something's wrong. I have to find out what. His determination solidified as he stepped out of the car and walked to the nearest house. An elderly man answered the door, his brow furrowed at the unexpected visitor. "Sorry to bother you this late," Ethan began, trying to keep his tone calm. "I deliver to Mrs. Harper regularly, and tonight she seemed different. Have you noticed anything unusual?" The man's expression darkened. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her out in days. She usually waters her plants every morning, but the porch has been quiet. I just assumed she wasn't feeling well." Ethan thanked him and moved to the next house, where a young woman holding a steaming mug of tea answered. Her concern deepened as he explained the situation. "Actually, yes," she said slowly. "A couple of nights ago, I saw two men hanging around her house. They were knocking on her door, whispering to each other, and honestly, they didn't look like they belonged here. I thought about asking if she was okay, but I didn't want to overstep." Ethan's stomach tightened. Two men? His mind raced as he moved to the next house. A middle-aged man opened the door, his face immediately clouding over when Ethan brought up Mrs. Harper. "Yeah, I've seen them too," the man said grimly. "They've been hanging around her porch, knocking at odd hours. Last week, I told them to get lost, but they just sneered and walked off. Something about them didn't sit right. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. 3 different neighbors, 3 different warnings, all pointing to the same unsettling pattern. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't ignore the mounting dread in his chest. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was grim. Sitting in the driver's seat, he stared at Mrs. Harper's darkened house. Who are these men? What do they want? Ethan knew he couldn't let it end here. Ethan's determination hardened as he pulled up in front of Mrs. Harper's house again. The darkness seemed heavier now, the silence almost suffocating. The front door, which had been closed earlier, was slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. This isn't right. Mrs. Harper? He called out cautiously as he stepped inside. The house was eerily still, the air thick with a musty scent. Papers were scattered across the small table near the entryway, bills marked, overdue, in bold red letters, alongside a few prescription bottles knocked over. A chair lay tipped on its side, and the faint sound of labored breathing drew him further in. He pushed open the bedroom door to find Mrs. Harper slumped on the floor, clutching her chest. Her face was pale, her frail body trembling. Ethan rushed to her side, his heart pounding. Mrs. Harper, what happened? Are you hurt? Her eyes fluttered open, filled with a mixture of relief and fear. Ethan, I told you not to come back, she whispered hoarsely. I couldn't leave you like this, he replied, helping her sit up. What's going on? Who did this? Tears welled up in her eyes as she glanced toward the window, her voice breaking. They keep coming. 2 men, they want me to sell the house. They say they're here to help, but when I said no. She trailed off, her body shuddering as the fear consumed her. Ethan clenched his fists, his blood boiling. Vulnerable people like Mrs. Harper shouldn't have to live in fear, especially in their own homes. You're not facing this alone, he said firmly. We're getting you out of here. Her eyes searched his, a glimmer of hope breaking through the fear. But before they could move, a loud knock echoed through the house. Ethan froze. Mrs. Harper's face turned ashen. They're back, she whispered, her voice trembling. The loud knock came again, more insistent this time, reverberating through the house. Ethan's mind raced. He glanced at Mrs. Harper, who was clutching his arm, her face pale with fear. It's them, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan steadied his breathing, forcing himself to stay calm. We're leaving, he said firmly, helping her to her feet. Moving as quietly as possible, he guided her toward the back door. The air felt heavy, each step amplifying the tension. As they reached the kitchen, the front door rattled, followed by angry voices. Mrs. Harper! Open up! One of the men barked, his tone menacing. Ethan clenched his jaw, gripping Mrs. Harper's trembling hand tighter. Pushing open the back door, he led her out into the cool night air. The darkness outside felt almost welcoming compared to the danger lurking within the house. Quickly, Ethan helped her into his car, casting one last glance at the shadowy figures now trying to force their way inside. As he drove away, his heart pounded, but relief started to settle in. You're safe now, he assured her, though his determination grew stronger. He wasn't going to let this end here. The car rolled into the parking lot of a nearby motel. Ethan helped Mrs. Harper out, her frail frame leaning heavily on his arm. We'll rest here for now, he assured her, guiding her to a chair in the lobby. Her eyes, still wide with fear, began to soften slightly as the weight of the immediate danger lifted. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed. The first call was to a close friend who worked in elder support services. Explaining the situation, he received a promise for immediate help. We'll get her legal support, security, and anything else she needs, his friend said confidently. The next morning, a small team of advocates arrived at the motel. Ethan watched as they listened to Mrs. Harper's story, their faces grim with understanding. Legal action was set in motion. New locks and a security system were arranged for her home, and a community nurse was scheduled to check on her regularly. As the day progressed, neighbors began to rally around her. The same people who had voiced concerns earlier now offered tangible support, delivering meals, tending to her garden, and checking in frequently. Ethan stood nearby, feeling a mix of relief and pride. Mrs. Harper looked at him, her expression one of gratitude and newfound hope. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Ethan replied with a gentle smile. "You're not alone anymore." Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Harper's life began to stabilize. Her home, once a place of fear, became a sanctuary again. Thanks to Ethan and the community's unwavering support, the men who had harassed her were no longer a threat. The locks on her doors were stronger, but more importantly, so was her sense of belonging. Ethan continued visiting her, not as a delivery driver but as a friend. They shared meals, laughter, and stories about her younger days. Every visit reminded him that kindness wasn't just about helping someone once. It was about building connections that lasted. One evening, as they sat in her cozy kitchen sharing a pizza, Mrs. Harper looked at Ethan with tear-filled eyes. "You didn't just save me, Ethan," she said softly. "You gave me hope." For Ethan, this wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about realizing the profound impact of caring for others. In helping Mrs. Harper, he'd found a purpose deeper than he ever expected. Stories like these remind us that even the smallest act of kindness can ripple outward, changing lives in ways we may never fully understand. If you've been touched by this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Join us for more tales of courage, humanity, and the power of compassion.